Okay, let's get going. Let me thank Senator Braun for serving as ranking member today, filling in for ranking member Graham. Let me also thank our colleagues who will be attending this hearing and our witnesses who will be with us this morning. Today, we are going to discuss an issue of enormous consequence, but which unfortunately is not talked about enough here in Congress, not talked enough about in the media. And that is the incredible concentration of ownership and power that a handful of Wall Street investment firms have over our entire economy and the enormous impact they have on workers, consumers, and virtually every person in our country. Today in America, just three Wall Street firms, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, manage $22 trillion in assets. Let me repeat that. Three companies manage $22 trillion in assets. So what does that mean? Well, for starters, it means that the amount of money these three firms control is nearly equal to the entire gross domestic product, the GDP of the United States. Three companies and more than 5 times the GDP of Germany. These three firms, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, are major shareholders in more than 96% of S&P 500 companies. In other words, they have significant influence over many hundreds of companies that employ millions of American workers and, in fact, enormous impact over our entire economy. Let's talk about banking. We all remember that after the Wall Street crash of 2008, there was a whole lot of discussion about the wealth and the power of the major banks that were, quote unquote, too big to fail. You all remember that? Well, these three Wall Street investment firms that we're talking about today are the largest shareholders of some of the biggest banks in America, JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, and Citibank. In other words, they have enormous influence over enormous banks. Let's talk about transportation. These three Wall Street firms are among the top owners of all 4 major airlines: American, Southwest, Delta, and United. What about healthcare? Everybody is concerned about healthcare, the cost of healthcare in America. Together, these three firms own an average of 20% of the major drug companies in America. Wall Street firms in general have bought up thousands of nursing homes. Everybody is concerned about the quality, cost of nursing homes. They bought up thousands of nursing homes where profits have been soaring at the same time as mortality rates have gone up as well. These three firms are also responsible for the astronomical prices at emergency rooms. Yes, three firms own emergency rooms in hospitals all across this country, increasing prices by over 60% and driving over 500,000 Americans into bankruptcy each year. These three firms will tell you that they are passive investors, that they are not involved in the day-to-day decisions of the companies they own. But let us be clear. These three companies control nearly 1/4 of votes at shareholder meetings, leveraging their power to influence CEO compensation, stock buybacks, environmental commitments, mergers, and pension benefits. In addition to the big three, a small handful of Wall Street vulture funds, so-called private equity firms, also have an enormous control over industry after industry after industry. Over the past 2 decades, private equity takeovers have slashed nearly 1.3 million jobs and shut down nearly 20 100,000 stores in the retail industry, including Toys R Us, Payless, and Dollar General. Let's talk about housing. Housing. Last year, a small number of Wall Street firms and other extremely wealthy investors bought about 1 out of every 7 homes in some of the largest cities in America, and now own over 1 million apartments, hiking rents by as much as 30% and neglecting needed repairs and the safety of tenants. And interestingly enough, if you haven't heard much about the power of these Wall Street firms, well, it may have something to do with the fact that a small number of Wall Street firms control about half of the newspapers in America. Now, we are talking about a small number of Wall Street firms that buy up companies, load them up with debt, and make a huge amount of money by laying off workers, slashing wages, shipping jobs overseas, and eliminating health care and pension benefits. According to recent studies, after these Wall Street firms take over companies as a result of leveraged buyouts, jobs are slashed by 13%, wages fall by 6%, and the companies that Wall Street firms take over are 10 times more likely to declare bankruptcy. When we talk about power in America, many people think that, the President of the United States, pretty powerful guy, that he is the most powerful person in this country. Well, frankly, I am not so sure. Given the enormous power that the CEOs of these extremely large Wall Street financial firms have over our economy, it may well be that these guys are more powerful than the President of the United States. And that brings us to where we are today with Warrior Met Coal in Brookwood, Alabama, where workers have been engaged in a strike for 11 months, fighting for economic justice, fighting for dignity on the job. In 2016, a group of private equity funds led by Apollo and Blackstone acquired Walter Energy and formed Warrior Met Coal. As part of the restructuring, workers were forced to take a $6 per hour wage cut, over 20% of their wages, and massive cuts to their health care and retirement benefits. The concessions the miners made 5 years ago saved Warrior Met $1.1 billion. Let's be clear. The workers agreed to these cuts with the understanding that they would be restored when the company returned to profitability. That is not what happened. While Warrior Met has returned to profitability and could afford to pay its CEO, Walter J. Scheller III, $4 million in compensation each year, it has reneged on that deal and is offering workers an insulting $1.50 raise spread, $1.50 over 5 years, about 30 cents an hour increase over 5 years, while refusing to restore the health care and pension benefits that were taken away from them in 2016. Now, so everybody should understand this, I invited Mr. Scheller, the CEO of Warrior Met, to testify at this hearing. He was invited. I wanted to ask him how, over the last 5 years, Warrior Met could afford to provide $1.5 billion in stock buybacks and dividends to its wealthy shareholders and huge bonuses to its executives, but somehow could not afford to treat its workers with the dignity and respect they deserve. Once again, concessions made by the workers totaled $1.1 billion over 5 years. Stock buybacks and dividends over the same period totaled $1.5 billion. I invited for this hearing Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock and the largest shareholder of Warrior Met, to testify at this hearing. My hope was, and my hope remains, that Mr. Fink will do the right thing and demand that Warrior Met's management sit down with their workers and negotiate a contract in good faith. Unfortunately, Mr. Fink has declined to testify. Further, I invited Stephen Schwartzman and Mark Rowan, the CEOs of Blackstone and Apollo, to testify at this hearing as well. Unfortunately, all of them declined to participate. The good news is, however, that we have a number of excellent witnesses who are not afraid to come before the public and answer questions. They include Braxton Wright, a worker at Warrior Met, Cecil Roberts, the president of the United Mine Workers of America. Our last panel will include several economists who have studied and written extensively on this issue. Now, let me just be very clear about this. What is happening at Warrior Met is not an aberration. It is not an exception to the rule. At a moment of unprecedented corporate greed in this country, attacks against working people are taking place in company after company, industry after industry. And here is a dangerous reality. Never before in the history of the United States of America have so few owned so much and had so much power over our economy. This extraordinary concentration of ownership held by Wall Street over our economy is an issue that Congress and the American people must deal with. And with that, let me introduce Senator Brown and recognize him for his opening remarks. Senator?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate how far witnesses have traveled to come here today to discuss this. It's a multifaceted discussion. This is the Budget Committee. And I think the whole issue of concentration in industry, I came from Main Street America, where we had no help from government, and we didn't have any of the crony capitalist things that occur largely through this place that gives a leg up to many industries. I'll cite that in the classic way the economy should work, you should have full competition, no barriers to entry. You should have an engaged and informed consumer. Those are the elements that make capitalism and free markets work. Sadly, over time, they evolve in a different way. But I'll go back to my original point. This is the Budget Committee, and I'm not sure that this is the jurisdiction that we can discuss it. Of course, the chair can discuss whatever he wants to. I think there's validity in looking at some of those issues. I'm going to focus on what I think we should be doing, and that's talking about the fact that we just recently eclipsed $30 trillion in debt as a country. The senator and I have had a vibrant discussion on the floor, reaching about 26 to 27 minutes 6-7 months ago. And I know there's a difference of opinion there too. But when it comes to how any entity works, you cannot borrow from your kids and grandkids on things that you are consuming, as much as we'd like to do it for whatever the benefit is that might accrue. It's a bad business plan. It'll run into the ditch in a hard way, and we'll have to reconcile it down the road to where currently we ought to be looking at the drivers of it, which would be Medicare, Social Security, programs everybody would want to be there and to be in sound shape. We keep plowing ahead now with $1.5 trillion deficits baselined, taking us into that next tier of indebtedness. It will not be a good ending for all the people that depend on it, mostly elderly, for their retirement and their health care. What I'd like to do is get back to the essence of this committee, which means that we do regular order, discuss these things, not talking about spending, a CR vote that we're going to have later today, where we're talking about a budget that should have been worked on last year, finished with all appropriations done by September 30th, 2021. That's not running the place very well for all the people that depend upon it. In this particular dispute with workers and mine, that's probably not the domain of the Budget Committee, although I understand the relevance of it. It probably should be kept in the private sector because it's currently part of a legal dispute. Now look at what the Biden administration did when it got the reins. We had 1% inflation. We were raising wages in the toughest places, the old-fashioned way. We weren't making government the centerpiece of our lives. I understand through frustration how it's easy to go there. But you look at some of the first moves. And now, remember, we're asking OPEC to produce more oil when we shut down the Keystone XL pipeline. We were stopping exploration and drilling on our federal lands. And I'm the guy that started the climate caucus here on the Republican side, and I believe in the long run, the cleanest, least expensive fuel is going to win the day. But we can't ignore the things that we should be doing, like budgets through regular order, like remaining energy independent in the short run, so that we're not in positions like we currently find ourselves. We're 100% dependent for 17 key mineral resources, and a lot of the new technology that we'll be addressing climate issues with. Who's cornering the market? It's China. And when we get diverted, and when we don't do budgets, when we get down a trail that's unsustainable, we're going to end up with problems and issues that are going to be far greater than what we're talking about here today. American families want us to get a few things right. They want us to live within our means. They don't want us to borrow money from their kids and their grandkids, and we should all be working together in the proper jurisdiction to address these issues. But when it comes to the Budget Committee, I think we ought to stay more focused on it, and I know that it hasn't been popular to do it the old-fashioned way. We've only put a budget together, I think, once in the last 20 years. I'll end with this quote from Admiral Mike Mullen, and this is from Defense. And I think part of the problem here in D.C. is that we roll over for each other's needs. Republicans for defense when we hold it sacrosanct, and we don't require it to do audits. The other side of the aisle getting way ahead of its skis when we can't afford it, even though it might be well-intentioned. He said, as it relates to defense, and we're looking at it right now with Putin peering into Ukraine, and I fear red ink more than I do the red menace. And I think that's a good statement that ought to be put into practice and that we ought to look at for across this federal government.
Thank you, Senator Brown. We are pleased today to have two United States senators with us who will be making remarks. We begin with Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, who is the chair of the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee's Economic Policy Subcommittee. She has spent years studying and writing about all things relating to private equity and asset management industries, and is a champion of working people in this country. Senator Warren, thanks so much for being with us.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your inviting me to participate in this hearing, and I appreciate the powerful work that you have been doing on the issue of economic concentration. You are an extraordinary and a tireless leader, and I am honored to be in this fight with you. So, thanks to you, today we have the opportunity to discuss the very real impact that private equity and Wall Street giants have had on workers and communities across this country. For nearly a year, more than 1,100 Warrior Met coal miners in Brookwood, Alabama have been on strike. They are striking for nothing more than what they are owed: fair pay, fair benefits, and fair working conditions. All of these were stripped away when giant vulture private equity firms swooped in to buy Warrior Met's predecessor company, Walter Energy, as it went through bankruptcy. Apollo, Blackstone, and the other private equity firms that bought Walter Energy in 2016 presented themselves as saviors, here to save the company, here to save jobs, here to save the day. But it was all hype. They showed up because they smelled profits. And they planned to boost those profits by crushing the company's workers. These private equity firms terminated the miners' collective bargaining agreement with United Mine Workers. They forced a pay cut of more than 20% on workers. They cut medical, leave, and retirement benefits. And just to juice their profits a little more, they ended the company's pension and health obligations to 2,800 retired coal miners and their families. Private equity was the driving force behind all of this. The private equity investors in Warrior Met dictated the terms and conditions of the 2016 takeover of the company, and those same private equity investors continue to bear responsibility for the cuts in pay and the benefits that have pressed workers to the wall and led to the current Warrior Met's miners' strike. Coal mining is dangerous work. The hours are long, the tasks are backbreaking. But when private equity took over, miners were told that all that hard work just didn't produce enough revenue to give the workers the protection and the security that they had earned. Money was supposedly tight, but the investors, Apollo, Blackstone, and the other private equity firms, what happened to them? They made out like bandits. They ran the same play that private equity has run over and over and over. They loaded Warrior Met up with debt, and then they used that debt to pay nearly $800 million in dividends to themselves and other shareholders. And then, after sucking as much cash for themselves out as they possibly could, private equity sold off their shares and moved along to the next victims. Warrior Met miners are on strike today because private equity ripped them off. What happened to Warrior Met workers is what happens when these billion-dollar Wall Street firms come to town. Private equity squeezes as much as they can out of the companies and their employees, and when they think there's nothing left to squeeze, they leave everyone else in the dirt. Nationwide, private equity's takeover of retail has killed more than 1.3 million jobs over the last decade. It is responsible for jacking up prices for consumers in everything from education to healthcare. The arrival of private equity can even be a matter of life and death. Research shows that when private equity takes over a nursing home, short-term mortality rates jump by about 10%. But even as they keep raking in billions of dollars in fees, the typical private equity fund hasn't managed to outperform the stock market since at least 2006. Think about that. They strip assets and squeeze workers with frightening energy, but they don't actually make a better rate of return than the average mutual fund. All that destruction comes with a lot of high overhead costs, and the result is only modest returns to investors. Now, this is why I introduced my Stop Wall Street Looting Act in 2019, and why I reintroduced it a few months ago, so we can put an end to predatory and dangerous private equity practices. This is not about killing private equity. It's about fixing the system and protecting workers and communities. My bill would prevent private equity firms from walking away after driving companies into the ground and leaving workers in the dirt. My bill prioritizes worker pay in the bankruptcy process and strengthens the rules so that workers are more likely to receive severance, pension, and other pay that they earned. My bill creates incentives for job retention so that workers like Warrior Mets can benefit from a company's second chance in bankruptcy. And my bill ends the immunity of private equity firms from legal liabilities when those companies break the law. When workers at a plant are shortchanged or residents at a nursing home are hurt because private equity firms force it to cut corners, private equity should be on the hook. So, Mr. Chairman, I thank you again for allowing me to testify today, and I appreciate your partnership on these issues. I'm going to keep fighting to end the outrageous practices of private equity firms. I'm going to keep fighting to turn the Stop Wall Street Looting Act into law, and I'm going to keep fighting to make sure that Warrior Met workers get what they are rightfully owed. Thank you.
Senator Warren, thank you very much. Our next panelist is Senator Tommy Tuberville, who is the junior senator from the state of Alabama, the home of the Warrior Met Coal Company. Senator Tuberville, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, Chairman Sanders and Ranking Member Braun. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before the Senate Budget Committee on an issue that directly impacts my state of Alabama. And with that, I want to first welcome my constituent, Braxton Wright, who will be testifying on the next panel. Next, I want to associate myself with the remarks made by Ranking Member Braun. While this is not the first time the chairman has directly involved himself in union dealings in my home state of Alabama, I want to make it clear and on the record, I do not believe the Budget Committee has a jurisdiction over matters involving labor practices across our country. If a hearing like this should take place at all, it should be in front of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pension Committee, better known as HELP, which I am a member. That being said, I think it is inappropriate for Congress to weigh in on labor disputes which are properly being resolved through the judicial system. Workers in private companies across our nation have the right to decide whether they want to join a union or not. My home state of Alabama is a right-to-work state, and we're proud of that fact. Our workers are not forced to join a union. They have the right to decide, and there is some companies operating in Alabama that have workforces who voted to have a union in place. So to me, it's clear that the purpose of this hearing is for the majority to push a political agenda. This hearing is what I call the Dream Democrat political parlay, where members can be pro-union, anti-Wall Street, and anti-mining production all in one hearing. I want to make sure the record accurately reflects the facts and figures of what is being discussed today with Warrior Met Coal, located in Brookwood, Alabama. The jobs at Warrior Met Coal pay an average wage of over $97,000 annually. This is one of the top average wages in the state. Since Warrior Met Coal was established in 2016, it has created an additional 600 jobs. On April 1st, 2021, Warrior Met workers initiated a strike. 4 days later, on April the 5th, the International Union Mine Workers of America accepted a contract proposal by Warrior Met. However, the local union membership took a vote and did not ratify it. Since then, it is my understanding that there have been 9 contract proposals offered by Warrior Met to union officials, but none of these offers have been presented to the Alabama union workforce for a vote. How can the workforce get back to work if they are not shown the latest offers on the table? That doesn't make sense. And again, neither does this venue. The Budget Committee or Congress in general is not the proper place to litigate a labor dispute between private companies and workforce. Clearly, Congress has enacted laws and established agencies and practices to handle these exact type of labor disputes. Our federal courts and the Department of Labor's National Labor Relations Board, or NLRB, have already made multiple decisions in this case. I strongly question the overt political influence of this hearing and the strong pro-union stance of this committee. Actions like holding this hearing seek to call into question the judicial system and labor ruling decisions of the NLRB. I want to make it clear, Congress does not have any decision-making authority between Warrior Met Coal and the union members, nor should we get involved in how they work out their own labor agreements. Congress has decision-making authority over the federal budget and how much money our government spends. That is what I think the committee should be paying attention to, not the labor disputes in private companies in Alabama. We have to get our physical house in order. Inflation has engulfed our economy. Families face bare grocery shelves, and gas is more than $5 a gallon in some places. Our national debt has gone over $30 trillion. That amounts to a credit bill for $240,000 per taxpayer in this country. We need to return to free market enterprise with less government intervention. In closing, it is my hope that Warrior Met Coal and the union workforce can come to a beneficial agreement for all involved, and that Congress will not try to tip the scales in one direction. We must get Americans to work so that our economy can once again thrive. I thank the committee for their time and consideration for my comments. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Tuberville. And now we will hear from the second panel. Okay. This panel will consist of Cecil Roberts, who is the International President of the United Mine Workers of America. President Roberts is a sixth-generation coal miner raised in Kanawha County, West Virginia. He rallies with Warrior Met workers on the picket line in Alabama every week. Our second panelist is Braxton Wright, who is a mine employee at Warrior Met and a member of the United Mine Workers, Local 2368. He has worked at the Brookfield Mine for 17 years and has been on strike since April 1st, 2021. We have also invited, as I mentioned earlier, to this hearing, the CEO of Warrior Met, Walter J. Scheller III. Unfortunately, he has chosen not to be with us. We will now hear from Cecil Roberts, the International President of the United Mine Workers of America. Mr. Roberts, thanks so much for being with us.
Well, thank you, Senator, for scheduling this hearing and inviting us to participate. We appreciate the willingness to hear from workers here today. I want to thank Ranking Member Braun also for allowing us to be here today, and the panelists here, the senators here on this committee. My good friend Senator Kane is here, and this is an opportunity that workers do not always have to have their voice heard here on Capitol Hill. Today is the 323rd day of our strike in Alabama. I would like to take this opportunity to invite Senator Tuberville to stop by at his convenience, and maybe he could be of some help with respect to encouraging Warrior Met to join with the United Mine Workers and fashion an agreement to end this strike. 323 days, but this didn't start 323 days ago. I think it would be fair to say that not a single coal miner ever caused a bankruptcy. No one ever asked the shuttle car operator, do you want us to invest some money here or there? They don't ask the continuous miner that. They don't ask the longwall operator that. All these decisions that lead to bankruptcy are made by others than the coal miners. In 2015, there was a bankruptcy filing by Walter Energy, and that hearing for that bankruptcy took place in Alabama. The first thing that happened in this bankruptcy is something that's been alluded to here by both you and Senator Warren. Retirees, 2,700 of them, sitting at home, 75, 85 years old, giving their lives to this industry, get a notice. Well, the bankruptcy judge decided you don't have health care. The second thing that happens is the pension plan goes away. The next thing that happens is that the collective bargaining agreement that was ratified by an overwhelming majority of these workers that was in place at the time is terminated. The next thing that happens is what? Most people don't know this. You don't have a job here anymore. So theoretically, not theoretically, in reality, people get discharged in bankruptcy court. Now, who decided that that was going to happen? How did that come about? At the time, these investors from New York, mainly, were playing a role already with respect to what was going on in the bankruptcy court. So now, workers who had nothing, absolutely nothing to do with this filing of this bankruptcy or creating this bankruptcy are now being told, well, you've got to fix this. The workers have to fix this. How in the world is that going to take place? First thing that happens is we are told by this private equity group, well, we don't have to hire a single one of your members back. They're unemployed as far as we're concerned. Now, if you want to get your members back to work, you have to deal with us and reach an understanding with us. And if that understanding is something we want, then there'll be an opportunity for your members who've got 40 years in this coal mine, 30 years, 20 years, been there forever, producing coal for this company that was there previously. Now they're telling us, you don't have any leverage. You know what? They're right. That's the truth. Can you imagine trying to bargain with somebody that's taking the coal mines over, who came here from New York and don't even know what color the coal is, don't have any idea what happens in a coal mine, but they're telling us, we're not hiring those people back unless you do certain things, and they've already gotten everything that you could ever ask for as an investor or an employer out of the bankruptcy court. You've canceled health care for retirees. You've terminated the contract. You've now terminated the employees unless your union bargains their way back in. So now the union's at the bargaining table with this group. And we do reach an agreement. It was a terrible agreement. But the workers were told the truth. If we don't reach an agreement with this group, they don't have to hire us. We won't be here to represent you, and who knows what's going to happen to this place. No entity should have that kind of power delegated to them by the laws that are passed here in this location that we're sitting now. That's the law. Bankruptcy laws are horrendous for working class people. There's been 60-some of these in the coal fields of Appalachia. No group of workers should be treated. And let me tell you what's happened since that contract was ratified. It's been 5+ years. Senator Tuberville said how much money they make. You know, you go in the mines and spend 12 hours a day, 6 days a week for a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. These workers are totally exhausted and they're totally fed up. About the contract that was voted on, the one thing that this committee should know, it failed 95-5. These other agreements he's talking about are the same agreement. They changed this word, they changed that word, new proposal. That's what we've been faced with for about a year now. I think it's disgraceful that these workers have been on strike this long of a time. And you're going to hear momentarily from Braxton Wright, who's been on this picket line daily, and he's one of the leaders of our union on that level. His wife Hayden has headed up our auxiliary. But there are 800 of these families that's not only suffered through this strike, but they have suffered for 5+ years because of what happened to them when these investors rolled into town and couldn't spell code, couldn't tell you what color it is. All they knew is there's some money to be made here, and they're gone now. They're gone now. And we're tasked for how we keep this company profitable. The coal is selling, by the way, for about $500 a ton. This is metallurgical coal. You would have to work at it to make money with respect to the price of coal being at that level. With that, I yield, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Roberts, thank you very much. Our next panelist is Braxton Wright, who's a mine employee at Warrior Met and a member of UMWA Local 2368. He has worked at the Brookfield mine for 17 years. He has been on strike since April 1st, 2021. Mr. Wright, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. Chairman Sanders, Ranking Member Braun, distinguished members of the committee, my name is Braxton Wright. I've worked at the mines in Brookwood, Alabama for over 17 years. I come from a family of coal miners. My grandfather was injured in a mining accident at Black Diamond Mines in West Blockton and later passed away to his injuries. My father worked in the coal mines a short time. My father-in-law is a retired UMWA miner who retired at the time of the Walter Energy bankruptcy with more than 30 years. Today, I would like to speak with you about how private equity firms such as Apollo, Blackstone, and other private equity who held stock in Walter Energy dictated the terms and conditions of the 2016 takeover of Walter Energy, which was renamed Warrior Met Coal, and what that means to workers, families, and communities. These private equity investors bear much of the responsibility for the cuts in pay and benefits and have led to the United Mine Workers' unfair labor practice strike at Warrior Met. The past 5 years working under this bankruptcy contract has been difficult for the miners and their families. These private equity groups have played a role in the exploitation of UMWA miners as well as numerous other workers who do not have the benefit of a union contract. Due to the Chapter 11 bankruptcy filed by Walter Energy in 2016, miners took massive concessions in order to make the company profitable again. Some of these concessions included a $6 an hour pay cut depending on your pay grade. It by itself placed a huge strain on workers and their families. When you are required to work 12 hours a day, 6 to 7 days a week, if you're lucky to see your spouse or children more than a few hours a day. Before the bankruptcy, many of the spouses didn't have to have a second job or didn't have to work. After the bankruptcy, many spouses were forced to work outside the home while still being primary caregiver. So the children saw both parents less as a result of the cuts in the bankruptcy contract. It would break your heart to hear how many times my oldest daughter, Avery, would ask me, "Why wasn't you at my game? Why didn't you come to my field trip or awards day at school? Why can't you go with us to the park?" Every time I had to answer, I had to work or I had to sleep. Knowing that my child deserved to have time with both parents, these have been the voices of hundreds of children's that's parents work at, Warrior Met Coal. While Warrior Met claims to give us 8 holidays, in actuality, they only dedicated 3 holidays spent with our families: Thanksgiving, Christmas Eve, and Christmas Day. The push to increase production and profits for investors at the expense of the workers is amplified more with a 4-strike policy implemented in 2016. All absences, late arrivals, or early outs result in a strike. On the 4th occurrence, you would be fired. This policy was a huge source of stress and worry for families. If you arrived a few minutes late, you were still required to work, but you still received a strike. If you were involved in an accident, medical emergency, your child was sick or hospitalized, your spouse was in labor or hospitalized, it didn't matter. If you could not give a 24-hour notice, you would receive a strike. My brothers and sisters have been given strikes for having accidents on their way to work. and being late. Our spouses learned not to call and tell us about accidents or emergencies until after we were done with our shift, out of fear of us receiving a strike. So So when my own daughter was in the hospital and I was working 12-hour overnight shifts, my wife was afraid to tell me she had been admitted until my shift ended at 7, because if I left, she knew I would receive a strike. I worked my shift in Brookwood, then drove to the hospital, and then drove back to the mines, back and forth for 3 days in order to be with my family. These unfair labor practices and conditions led the UMWA rank and file membership to strike starting on April 1st, 2021. We are still fighting for a better contract for ourselves, our families, and our communities. We are waiting on Warrior Met, whose largest shareholder is BlackRock, to come to the table and offer a fair contract to those of us whose labor has been used to make them billions. This is why I'm asking that you support the Stop Wall Street Looting Act, which will help to reform private equity industry. This bill would help workers, families, and communities by forcing private investment firms like BlackRock to take responsibility for the actions of the companies they take over. Management at Warrior Met has stated we will starve them out, and they aren't worth anything else. The investment firms that own Warrior Met need to be held accountable for these statements and the treatment workers have endured, not only while on strike, but for the past 5 years. While the company I have helped make billions of dollars over the past decade has turned their back on the workers during our strike, the UMWA has provided strike pay and insurance for the miners while on strike. So other unions and other workers across the country have provided solidarity and direct support. The auxiliary, made up with families from the mine workers, has worked tirelessly to bring and support for us to provide food, clothing, baby items, and holiday gifts to striking families. All workers deserve respect in our workplace and fair compensation for our labor. We will continue to fight for the UMWA brothers and sisters, and we will continue to speak out against the exploitation of workers by companies funded by private equity. We will continue to stand up for ourselves, but also for the workers, families, and communities suffering under the same circumstances. I have traveled with the UMWA to New York City to bring the strike to the doorsteps of BlackRock and call on them to take action to support the workers and communities they have invested in. BlackRock, Vanguard, and other private owners have responded in silence. I would like to ask Congress to take action to ensure that workers and families do not continue to be the victims of these private equity firms who do not care if workers are pushed to the limits as long as they're receiving the highest return on investment possible. Thank you for allowing me to be here today and to share the glimpse of why we are striking in Brookwood.
Mr. Wright, thank you very much for being with us. I would imagine that working people and their families who have been without a regular paycheck for almost a year are hurting. Can you talk a little bit about what it means to be on strike for over 300 days? What does it mean to the workers who are on strike, their kids, their families? Can you say a word about that?
It's been difficult. I mean, we've had to, cut back on, non-necessary items. We don't get to go out as much as maybe we used to. Vacations are, cut off or ended. At times, like my wife was sick. Her pay was even cut out for a month. So it's kind of like, playing Russian roulette with bills. You throw them out on the table and pick up which one you're going to pay at the time. But it's difficult to tell your children that you can't do things because you're not at work right now, that you're on strike. Most of us has picked up other jobs at other places, to make ends meet, but it's not the same as what we're accustomed to. But,
How do folks feel about a company, as Mr. Roberts mentioned, that knows very little about the industry, making huge profits, providing stock buybacks, at the same time as workers are experiencing major cuts in wages and healthcare. How do people respond to that?
It's not fair. I mean, they exploit our work. They work us on skeleton crews with the less than what we had before the strike. And then we get to watch them, sit in the office and make $4 million a year or $1.2 million as a secretary, and say that we don't deserve what we make now. It's tough. It's tough, It's tough seeing that their lack of just care for their workers and their employees is.
Okay, let me ask Mr. Roberts a question. Mr. Roberts, has William Met come back to the negotiating table since you all went on strike in April of last year?
Sorry, yes is the answer to that. But quite frankly, there hasn't been any progress made at the bargaining table. The 9 contracts that Senator Tuberville alluded to are basically the same contract that was voted down 95-5 by our membership. And if those contracts had been put to the membership, they would say, what's the difference in these contracts? And you'd really have to search for the difference. They just continue to put the same contract on the table over and over and over. And I think what is going on here, and there's some evidence of this, by the way, they're trying to starve the union out, they're trying to starve the workers out. And as we speak here today, Warrior Met's all over the United States right now, advertising for workers, having job fairs to come to Alabama and take the jobs of Braxton and his brothers and sisters on strike. So we got the strike breaker piece of this at work also. They're paying those people more money and higher benefits than they've offered at the bargaining table for these workers. And it's clear, Senator, what's happening here. Jay Gould is an industrialist from the 20s, said I can hire half the working class to kill the other half. That's apparently what's going on here. There's a job fair that is held either today, or being held either today or this week in Pennsylvania. You can drive through the coal fields of West Virginia and Appalachia, and you'll see billboards. Come to Alabama and work for Warrior Met. This is the number you call. So they're soliciting people to come to Alabama, drive by these folks on the picket line, and to take their jobs.
Remind us again, what kind of pay cuts and healthcare benefit cuts have workers experienced in this process?
Originally, those pay cuts were $6 to $8 in that range. Somewhere in the second, third year of the contract, Warrior Met realized that people are not going to stay here and work for those kinds of wages. So they increased the wages of the 2 top classifications. They raised the wages for the lower classifications, but they're still $2 or $3 below what everybody else is making in neighboring mines that are organized. So they realized they had to do that. But here's the thing that we need to mention. The health care plan that was part of the original contract, and it still is there's a $7,000 out-of-pocket cost that each family might have to pay. So you take a wage cut, take money out of the household, and if you happen to have a sick child, as was just alluded to by my brother here, then you're reaching into the savings you had before to try to provide health care for your families.
What kind of wage increases are they offering now?
The contract that was voted down had about, I think, $1.50 over 5 years.
$1.50 over 5 years,
years.
averaging 30 cents an hour at a time when inflation is at 7%.
That's correct.
Okay. Senator Braun?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I come from the southwestern part of Indiana, where it's the only real mining in our state. I've been in underground mines surface mining is probably more dominant there. Braxton, you've got one of the hardest jobs that would be out there. When I looked, especially in the underground mines, what you put up with, that is something most people would choose not to do. I think today we're talking about the issue that you're wrestling with the company. I think you got to be careful too that you don't homogenize big corporations and private equity in with the rest of what drives this country, which would be businesses like mine, where you treat employees like your family. And in what we're going through currently, I think it's given due attention to issues, and you've got this tug of war between more and more concentrated industries, and you're in a particular pickle with it. I want to be on record citing that. My question is for Mr. Roberts. How many of the workers that you represent are coal miners? Roughly, by percentage and number, if you've got it handy.
Probably 80%.
80%. And then when you look at what has beset the industry, businesses, owners, and workers themselves, current policies to me look like, especially in light of China building a coal-fired plant weekly over there, that we're trying to deconstruct the industry. You had the issue of pulling permits at the Twin Metals facility up in Minnesota. Mr. Roberts, does that bother you in a broader sense in terms of where mining is headed, and how much do you think the current administration is kind of pushing you over the edge?
I was waiting on the buzzer to stop. Thank you for the question, Senator. The number of coal miners that have lost their jobs in the last 10 years, we put it about 40,000. Every coal mining job, particularly in Appalachia, also supports about 4 other jobs. And if you do the math on that, you're talking about 200,000 people have lost their jobs. There's a variety of reasons people have lost their jobs. I worked in a metallurgical coal mine myself, and I was fortunate enough to leave that mine in 1977, and membership has chosen to allow me to continue doing what I'm doing since 1977 by vote of the membership. But the first big hit to the coal industry was not regulations having to do with the generation of electricity. The first big hit was the closure of most of the steel industry in the United States and moving that offshore. And we have spoken out about that. If we wanted to bring jobs back to the coal fields, if we had a steel industry in the United States of America, we've spoken repeatedly here on Capitol Hill about how you bring jobs back to Appalachia. That's one way you could do that, because when the steel industry shut down in America, the marketplace moved to China and Brazil and other locations. And if we had those jobs back here, we would be able to reopen many of these metallurgical coal mines. Where I'm from, I was born as far up the holler as you could get on Cabin Creek. The blacktop ended and the dirt road started, and Shamrock Holler is a suburb of Cabin Creek Holler. So that's where I'm from. And all of that coal at K-Ford, coming down the holler, so to speak, up to at Dakota, that's all metallurgical coal. Winterford was all metallurgical. They were all gone. The coal is not gone. They just cannot ship that coal economically across the ocean and compete. And so we've spoken out and said, this is how you get jobs back in Appalachia. With respect to the generation of electricity in this country, we've never denied for 1 minute the existence of climate change, because I think that debate's been settled. What we have argued for is a way to allow people to keep their jobs as long as possible, use technology and investment in that technology to generate electricity. And we realize, and I think you don't have to do much more than look around, that as time goes on, less and less coal was being utilized to generate electricity in this country. So we're not just watching these things happen. We have ideas, and I know that might shock some people that a union's got ideas about the economy, and we've testified to those concepts here on Capitol Hill many times. So, it bothers me anytime somebody loses their job. One of the things that has repeatedly happened in this nation, and you can go back 100 years if you want, whenever an industry winds down, we do not have a program that exists in this United States of how to deal with those workers losing their jobs. And we've spoken out on that too. We think there should be some kind of supplemental pay for those workers as you transition, some opportunities to be trained and those jobs to be here. For example, right now, 2/3, I don't mean to get so long-winded, but you asked, and I'll shut up here in a moment, but two-thirds of all the windmills in the world are made in China, and they ought to be made here. And I would say that same thing for solar panels.
Well, thank you. And very briefly, I think that you've got to always be aware of where you want to go in the long run. And I said it earlier, the cleanest, least expensive fuel is going to win the day. But you got to be careful that you don't do things in the short run that actually accelerate what has already been a process for coal miners in the wrong direction. And I think this administration needs to pay more attention on distinguishing between the two. And I think the coal miners ought to speak up because, in my opinion, they're not distinguishing between what we may need to do to keep the industry alive so it could survive into the long run when other technology might make it relevant. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Ranking Member Braun, and thanks to our witnesses, one of whom is a friend and one of whom, even though, Mr. Wright, I've not met you, I know an awful lot of Virginians, just like you in Tazewell, Buchanan, Russell, and Wise counties. Been working with them for many, many years, and I'm really happy you're here today. I will say about President Roberts, doing what we do, all of us, is not easy. If you're doing this kind of work and you're in politics, it's a more than a 9 to 5. It's a nights and weekends job. I'm in my 28th year since I ran for city council in Richmond, and you sometimes wonder, like, is it worth it? It's worth it to have the chance to help folks every day, but it's also worth it because I've met people that I never would have met had I not done this. And I consider President Roberts just, it's almost worth the price of admission of being in public office 28 years that I can say I met you and we're friends. And I'm so inspired by your leadership. I also just, want to say I'm sitting here listening to this hearing today, and I'm thinking about my father, who ran an ironworker organized welding and metalworking shop in the stockyards of Kansas City. And I just grew up in a house that was a management house that didn't hate labor, but actually really liked labor. He had 6 employees in a good year, and in a really good year, 7 or 8, plus my 2 brothers and me and my mother. And the fact that so much of corporate America just seems to hate unions, I just didn't come up in a household like that. My dad told me that his workers' training and skill were going to put my brothers and I through college, and that my dad's business acumen was going to put his workers' kids through college. It was a team. And there could be disagreements, just like there can be disagreements within any family, but it was a team, and it wasn't the union was our enemy, and we got to bust the union, and we got to grind them to nothing, and we got to bankrupt out their contracts and bring in people who weren't. It was never about that. My dad got asked to be on the board of the Iron Workers Pension Fund. There were 3 employer reps and 3 employer reps on that board. And I remember when they asked him to do it, he was like, I only have 6 employees. This is a big union. You got big employers all over the country. Why would you ask a guy like me with a small little shop in the stockyards of Kansas City? He said, because you treat people with respect. Why wouldn't we treat people with respect? Why wouldn't we treat union workers with respect? I mean, yeah, it's about dollars. Yeah, it's about benefits. But underneath all of that, it's about respect. It should be about respect. And I just thank God I was raised in the kind of house I was raised in. And I'm so puzzled at the behavior of those who would want to grind down people because they want to exercise a right that's protected in law to act collectively. President Roberts, you and I we've worked on some important issues in the last few years, saving miners' health care. I remember being around a table in Castlewood, Virginia, with a lot of mining families who were really worried because they were about a week away from losing health care benefits. We did work together to save them, saving pensions of UMW members. We worked on that together, but there's an issue pending right now with us that we've got to work together on, and that's the Black Lung Disability Trust Fund. And I just want to ask you about this. The black lung issues are not getting easier, they're getting tougher. The treatment is getting tougher in a time of COVID, where people have respiratory issues for COVID. The coincidence of COVID and black lung is much more potentially damaging and fatal to people. Congress did not act at the end of the calendar year, and the elevated excise tax that funds the Black Lung Trust Fund to take care of people who are doing this extremely hard work is now challenged. Mr. President, I'd like you just to address this question. What is the importance of us fully funding this Black Lung Disability Trust Fund with the coal excise tax, and what's the implications if we do not restore it to the level it was until December 31, 2021?
Well, first of all, thank you for the kind remarks, Senator. And you've been a friend probably 40 years here. I'm getting older, and I want to thank both you and Senator Sanders for helping save the pensions and the health care of, I guess at the time, was 85 to 90,000 people. And that's been one of the most remarkable pieces of legislation ever passed here in this Congress, as far as I'm concerned. And it led to others having their protection also. But getting to your point, I would point out that this industry and this government never recognized pneumoconiosis as an occupational illness until 1969, and it took an explosion in West Virginia, killing 78 miners before they ever did. But to answer your question is, if we do not come up with a funding mechanism here, which there's one that exists, but we've just let it terminate for all intents and purposes. It's half of what it was. Even at full funding levels, it was not adequate to keep up with the number of people who are suffering from pneumoconiosis and dying in this country. There's been probably 100,000 people die since 1969 from this disease. And in your area, Southwest Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, and Southern West Virginia, silica's running wild there. That's the other thing we'd ask Congress to think about. That young people are getting pneumoconiosis mainly from silica, and we need a silica standard to save their lives. But we need to fund this program. If we don't fund it, at some point in time, Congress is going to say, we're not taking any more money out of the general treasury to pay these benefits. That's our fear, and that's why we need to deal with this.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Kane. Senator Toomey, I believe, is with us virtually. Senator Toomey, you there? Okay. I believe Senator Warner is with us virtually. Mark, you there?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it's always glad you hosting this hearing. And I want to first of all echo what my friend and colleague Senator Kane said to President Roberts, that we need those black lung benefits. And as I think President Roberts just indicated, the incidence of this disease hitting much younger miners is stunning. And Tim and I both see it in Southwest Virginia, and I know our colleagues in West Virginia see it as well. I know we're talking about private equity in a large way. I just want to bring to the committee's attention, and I don't want to shock the chairman on this, because he knows that I've been viewed as sometimes pretty pro-business, and I am, but some of these private equity funds, I'm going to raise a question about bankruptcy, but I just love the committee to know that, over the last couple of years, the Intelligence Committee has been hosting a series of classified briefings to alert business and academia and others about the challenges posed by the Communist Party in China. And when we criticize China, I want to make clear my beef is with the Communist Party, Xi Jinping's leadership, and their intellectual property theft, their authoritarian behavior. It is not against the Chinese people, and obviously not against Chinese Americans. But the practices of the Communist Party in China, we've shared on a regular basis with venture capital, with banks, with manufacturers, with the Chamber of Commerce, with college presidents. The only group, I hate to give Chairman Sanders more ammunition, but the only group that wouldn't even sit and listen was private equity. Because these private equity companies were making so much money investing in Chinese technology firms, the Alibabas, the Badus, the Tencents, that were then being used to create an Orwellian surveillance state in China, that they didn't want to hear the truth. Now, finally, we're starting these classified briefings. We actually met with counties from around the country yesterday. NACO was in town, again, bipartisan, just to lay out these challenges. And private equity has indicated they will finally sit and hear the truth, maybe because finally the Chinese government is clamping down on some of these tech companies where they made so much money. But it was embarrassing that this part of our financial network would not even hear some of the challenges posed by the Communist Party in China. That brings us to the question of the hearing, though, and President Roberts, I mean, one of the things we've seen, I remember Westmoreland Coal when it went in, we've got a bankruptcy provisions that allow workers and their pension benefits, I think, to fall Category 4. I know there was a case in Alabama that you all worked on, but a bankruptcy code, and I've been trying to work with Joe Manchin on, reestablishing a higher priority for workers and their pensions if a company goes under. That's going to take some changes under both Chapter 11 and Chapter 7 bankruptcy, but I know this is something your members have had to deal with, unfortunately, on way too often a basis. But can you speak to this issue about how we could make a bankruptcy code that's takes care of creditors, but it actually is fair to workers and pensioners as well?
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Senator, and I thank you for your friendship to not only me, but coal miners for many, many years. Yes, the problem with bankruptcy, there's multiple problems, but for workers to have to get into the back of the line and even fight for their jobs, I found that very offensive. I found that to be morally wrong, and I think Congress needs to deal with that aspect of it if they don't deal with anything else. Pensions and health care that people who have earned should be protected in bankruptcy. And I support the efforts that Senator Warren and Senator Manchin are trying to make the bankruptcy laws in this country a little more fair. But one of the things that invites these people to come in and try to, like that happened here at Warrior Met and has happened 60-some times in the coal fields over the past couple years, is the fact that workers don't have a chance in bankruptcy. And it goes to what I said in my opening statement, is that workers never create bankruptcy, but they're asked to pay for it. And that should not be the way things work in the United States of America.
Thank you, President Roberts, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this hearing.
Thank you, Senator Warren. Senator Toomey, are you there? Okay. I think with that, let me thank the panel, and now we'll hear from panel number 3. Gentlemen, thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Senator, for the hearing.
Anybody here live?
No.
Okay.
Wait a minute.
Eakin and the other witness are live.
Is that him? Where is that?
Holtz. That's Wood. I think that's Duncan. Wood here.
Okay, okay, so we have 4.
But Nomi is ready if you want to introduce
All
her.
right, all right. So we have 1 live and
We have.
okay. This is our third and last panel. Two of our guests are virtual and two are here in person. Our virtual guests are Nomi Prinz, who's an economist and author, and a former managing director at Goldman Sachs. As a former Wall Street banker, Dr. Prinz's work sheds a light on the manipulation and unethical practices of the banking industry. We'll hear from her in a moment. James Kwok is a research fellow at the University of Connecticut School of Law. He researches business law and corporate finance. He is the author of the book 13 Bankers, The Wall Street Takeover and the Next Financial Meltdown. Douglas Holtz Eakin, who is with us here in person, is the president of the American Action Forum. He is a former director of the Congressional Budget Office and served on President George H.W. Bush's Council of Economic Advisors. And Duncan Wood, who's also with us, is vice president for strategy and new initiatives at the Wilson Center. His work focuses on North American politics in Mexico and U.S.-Mexican ties. He lectures and publishes on hemispheric issues and relations, and we thank all of our panelists for being with us. Why don't we begin virtually with Nomi Prinz.
Thank you, Chairman Sanders and Senator Brown, for the privilege and opportunity to speak before you today. I am a former managing director of Goldman Sachs. Before that, I ran the International Analytics Group as a senior managing director at Bear Stearns in London. I've held positions at Lehman Brothers and the Chase Manhattan Bank. After years on Wall Street, the levels of greed, unparalleled influence, and unethical practices in the industry caused me to step away. Since then, I've worked to uncover the manner in which the global economy and our financial system has become so unequal, unjust, and fractured. In 2008, two of the investment banks that I'd once worked for went bankrupt and saw their risky bets and bad practices nearly tank the global economy. Those banks no longer exist, however, the economy remains on edge. Today, nearly a decade and a half later, we sit at another precipice of grave risk. Asset management, behemoths, and private equity institutions have amplified the distortion in financial markets. The magnitude of their influence over securities and companies has no historical comparison. Their unfettered access to policymakers and major institutions spans the world. These new financial giants are leaving smaller market participants from all parts of the economic spectrum exposed to concentrated systemic risk and diminished representation. Yes, it's true that Wall Street banks remain as powerful and influential as ever, but now asset management firms with trillions of dollars at their disposal have become more influential than governments and the regulatory entities responsible for keeping them in check. It's important to understand that at the top of this financial hierarchy stands BlackRock. The financial Goliath manages $10 trillion in assets. That's more money than the size of any other country's GDP besides China or the United States. BlackRock's meteoric rise has seen its assets triple since 2012 and nearly double from 5 years ago. The world's largest asset manager acts as a money manager, private equity fund, institutional investor, trading software platform, and government partner. What's truly made it untouchable is its ability to produce and attract capital to exchange-traded funds or ETFs. ETFs are attractive because they offer intraday liquidity for both buyers and sellers in the financial markets. But what the shock of the early days of the pandemic in 2020 showed us was that frenetic ETF activity can intensify panic in the markets. Quick outflows executed in bulk can exacerbate a falling market, which can hurt those that can afford at least the most. Ultimately, leveraging its government connections, BlackRock was awarded a no-bid contract to manage the Federal Reserve's corporate bond buying program. The contract allowed BlackRock the opportunity to essentially support its own investment-grade bond ETFs in the midst of a pressurized environment. BlackRock and its execs had access to confidential information and the ability to formulate business decisions for themselves and their larger clients. No other institution in the world has or had such access during or since that crisis. Currently, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street manage more than $22 trillion in global assets. For comparison, U.S. GDP stands just shy of $24 trillion. The asset management industry has only grown more concentrated at the top over the past decade. These big three dominate the market. Their growing stranglehold on U.S. equity participation provides them greater chances to hold veto power or directly influence business strategies for nearly all major corporate decisions. As these institutions expand further into the world of private equity, their ability to dictate corporate control and outright ownership in every sector of the economy will have a greater human cost. Private equity business practices are largely designed to extract capital, not build it. As a result, small businesses and communities caught in the private equity crossfire will come under greater control of big finance that puts cost and job cutting ahead of worker stability. Today, BlackRock and these other institutions have expanded to such a magnitude that they effectively are the market. This represents a monopoly sort of influence over competition, assets, and transactions. It elevates the systemic risk that the global financial system faces. This renders everyday people, retail investors, workers, and anyone with a 401k retirement plan exposed to the risk that these massive trillion-dollar institutions pose. These individual shareholders of ETFs or other funds seeking to invest their hard-earned money in the markets and build for retirement have had their ability to obtain a seat at the table reduced. By creating a shareholder pass-through structure similar to the kind that Wall Street has used for decades, we can strive to even the playing field and reduce the immense power of mega money managers. This would enable participants invested in ETFs or other funds to hold shareholder rights with respect to the corporations in which these vehicles are invested. Currently, these rights are retained by the asset management companies themselves. We should enact policies focused on reducing the sheer size and concentration of asset management institutions and private equity firms to establish a more efficient, transparent, and equitable marketplace. The risk of corporate wrongdoing, fiscal mishaps, unfair tax advantages, and conflicts of interest is too great to ignore. So is the possibility of extreme price movements due to the leverage and trading patterns of these mammoth asset management institutions. Our financial stability and security depends on addressing this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Prinz. Our next panelist is James Kwok, a research fellow at the University of Connecticut School of Law. Mr. Kwok, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Chairman Sanders, Ranking Member Braun, and the entire committee for your time today. I apologize I can't be with you today. For the past 10 years, I taught corporate law and corporate finance as a professor at the University of Connecticut. Previously, I co-founded Guidewire Software, which has been a public company since 2012. My topic today is the concentration of economic power. There are three major types of concentrated economic power in the United States. One is technology giants such as Amazon or Facebook, and we know all about them. The second is large private equity firms, each of which can control well over 200 companies. Senator Warren already spoke about how private equity firms use their power. The third is large asset management firms, primarily, as Dr. Prinz said, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. As she said, these three companies are major shareholders of virtually every large public corporation. This type of concentrated economic power is probably the least known of the three, so I focus on it here. Our economy is based on the principle of shareholder capitalism. The idea is that a corporation is controlled by its shareholders, who have the power to elect the board of directors. The basic idea is that the people who invest their money get to make the decisions. Now, the system is neither necessary nor is it ideal, but it is how most people think about corporate governance today. Today, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street effectively own more than 20% of most large corporations, and they cast about 25% of the votes in elections for directors. So why do they have this power? Because investors have been shifting their money into index funds, and the big three have a 90% market share in US stock index funds. And as Dr. Prinz said, the manager of an investment fund gets to cast the votes, not the investors in that fund, even though it's the investors whose money is at stake. Now, corporate executives tend to listen to the views of the largest shareholders, in part because those shareholders can vote them out of their jobs. So this means that a handful of executives at a handful of asset management companies have influence over virtually every large company. So the next question is, what are they doing with that power? And different observers have identified at least 4 different problems. So some people think that the big three actually do not provide enough oversight of corporate directors and executives. And the reason is that all the funds that track the same index, so for example, all of the S&P 500 index funds, get the same returns. So if you manage an index fund, you have no incentive to pressure companies to do anything, really. So that's number one. Number two is that some people, including Senators Toomey and Johnson, think that Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, is using his company's power to push his personal political agenda on the corporate sector. Fink has recently been very outspoken about the need for corporations to take climate risks seriously. Number 3, some people think, on the contrary, that the big three, despite Larry Fink's statements, are not doing enough about climate risks and other environmental, social, and governance concerns. Number 4, and perhaps most concerning, some scholars think that large asset managers are facilitating collusion between companies in the same industry. The idea is that if you own 10% of every airline, for example, you want them to collude instead of competing with each other. And economic studies have found that greater common ownership by asset managers leads to higher prices in both the airline and the banking industries. Now, not all of these criticisms can be true at the same time in the same company, but they point to the problems that the economic power of large asset management firms creates. Now, I don't want to overstate the point. Larry Fink today cannot give orders to corporate CEOs and expect them to be followed 100% of the time. But his power is increasing every year. So in summary, I would say this is not really shareholder capitalism anymore. This is financial intermediary capitalism, where the decisions are made by companies that accumulated other people's money, and they accumulated it because they are very good at administering and selling low-cost index funds. And I doubt that this is the best way to allocate power over our economy. So let's take the example of climate change. Again, some people think that BlackRock shouldn't do anything about climate change. Others think it's doing too much. But I think both sides should agree that how our nation's corporations respond to this challenge shouldn't depend on the personal opinions of one man. Just this week, Charlie Munger, who was Warren Buffett's lieutenant for decades, said, and I quote, "We have a new bunch of emperors, and they are the people who vote the shares in the index funds. I think the world of Larry Fink, but I'm not sure I want him to be my emperor." End quote. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Cook. Our next panelist is Douglas Holtz Eakin, who is the president of the American Action Forum. Mr. Holtz Eakin, thanks a lot for being with us.
Well, thank you, Chairman Sanders, Ranking Member Braun, and members of the committee for the privilege of being here today. Let me make a couple of points very quickly, and then I look forward to answering your questions. The first point is to just remind us that it's useful in these circumstances to step back from the particulars of this case and remember that financial markets have a very important role to play in the U.S. economy. Financial markets are the mechanism by which we take the savings of each household, pool them together, and provide the capital that businesses need to start up, to expand, to improve their technologies, and that intermediation is a crucial function. It's financial markets that allow people to diversify their financial holdings and thus get away from the risk of a particular holding. It allows them to mitigate health risks, longevity risks, disability risks, all sorts of risk management to make their lives more secure and more safe. And it's the way by which we separate ownership and management. So we can specialize in management while having the owners control the shares in publicly traded companies and other arrangements like that. And the U.S. has been successful largely because it has the deepest, most liquid, best capital markets on the planet. And the beneficiaries of that success have been the American households who, from the end of World War II to the Great Recession, saw the standard of living double every 35 years. And you could imagine a family like mine where my father came out of the Navy and went to work in the steel industry and in those 35 years rose into the middle class and was very successful. Point number two is within those financial markets, there are many different business models. We have banks, we have insurance companies, we have mutual funds, we have pension funds. We have a myriad of business models that are competing to provide those services that households value in the financial area. And PE is one of those business models. And at least to my eye, the rule that one ought to adhere to is that policies, whether they be tax or legal or regulatory, bankruptcy, those policies should tilt the playing field as little as possible among those business models so that they have to deliver on the basis of their performance, not on having an advantage in the policy arena. PE does appear to be successful in that competition. In my written testimony, we have a variety of measures of the success, 10-year average rate of return of 12.3% on the decade leading up to 2020, 11.7 million workers, and point three, they're probably more successful than that because the basic model is to take entities that need restructuring that are performing below average and deliver higher returns. And so getting the market rate of return is actually quite an accomplishment in those circumstances. And so I think we have reason to believe that the PE model is a successful model on the whole and across the economy. And so my last point is simply that particular policies, whether it's legislation like Senator Warren's Stop the Wall Street Looting Act, which contain provisions that are targeted just on one entity, in this case, 100% tax on fees from portfolio companies, an increase in the tax on carried interest, limited interest deductibility, restriction of dividends, special treatment of workers in bankruptcy, special liability rules for PE. Those kinds of provisions are not going to satisfy the neutrality dictum and are not the way I think Congress ought to pursue whatever issues do arise. I prefer instead, as Senator Warner mentioned, rethinking bankruptcy law as a whole if there needs to be a higher priority placed on workers, health insurance, pensions, whatever it might be, do that in a neutral fashion across all entities and don't discriminate against a single business model. But I thank you for the chance to be here today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. Duncan Wood is a Vice President for Strategy and New Initiatives at the Wilson Center. Dr. Wood, thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, Chairman Sanders, Ranking Member Braun, distinguished committee members. My remarks today will focus on the challenges facing the critical mineral supply chain and the need for concerted action by government and the private sector to address a significant and growing deficit in the availability of these resources as the global energy transition brings a dramatic increase in demand. In the summer of last year, the Wilson Center convened a critical minerals working group made up of stakeholders from industry, academia, and civil society to examine the vulnerabilities that exist in the supply chain and to discuss how the private sector and government can address them. The working group produced a report titled The Mosaic Approach, which identified three main vulnerabilities. The first, namely, to meet its climate goals, the United States must face rapidly and dramatically rising demand for critical minerals whilst it is constrained by chronic underinvestment in mining, processing, infrastructure, and human capital. Current trends show that demand for critical minerals outpaces that of supply and will continue to rise, particularly considering the key role that critical minerals will play in the clean energy transition. An International Energy Agency assessment found that to reach the Paris Agreement goals of less than a 2 degrees Celsius rise in global temperature, clean energy technologies would demand 4 times the current mineral input by the year 2040. The IEA foresees mineral demand specifically for electric vehicles and grid storage for EV batteries to increase by at least 30 times by 2040. The second challenge the United States faces is from China. Intense competition from China for access to critical minerals, and we must recognize the intense geographic concentration of both the extractive and processing activities for critical minerals. China's dominant position in the supply chain stems not only from its ownership and control of critical minerals mines, but also processing facilities. In the maps I've included in my written testimony, you can observe the impressive geographical concentration of resources and processing facilities that leaves the U.S. at a huge geopolitical and competitive disadvantage. China has assumed a dominant position in the processing of cobalt, around 50% of global processing capacity, rare earth elements, around 80%, and lithium, around 50%, all of which are essential minerals for the clean energy transition. The United States must invest in both extraction and processing to meet the challenge. Third, there's a governance challenge that impacts the first two vulnerabilities, in which mining firms from the United States, unlike their Chinese counterparts, must adhere to justifiably stringent compliance measures in the areas of environment, society, and transparency disclosure regulations, regardless of whether they're operating domestically or internationally. Permitting requirements on U.S. mining firms place them at a competitive disadvantage compared to Chinese competitors and provide a strong disincentive for developing resources within the United States. As this challenge becomes clear, it's also obvious that the United States has fallen behind in the extractive industries. In part, this is because we have not invested enough in mapping our resources, in part because we've relied too heavily on sourcing from other countries, and in part because it's overly costly and time-consuming to develop these essential mineral resources here in the U.S. One of the biggest impediments to the development of new mineral resources here is to be seen in the permitting process. Whereas permitting in Australia and Canada, countries that have suitably high standards, typically takes between 2 to 3 years for a new mine, here in the U.S. it takes between 7 to 10 years, with companies subject to 30 or more local, state, and federal regulations and programs. It's important to emphasize here that I'm not suggesting a lowering of standards. Strong environmental protections remain a priority for mining companies, in part due to the demands of investors, in part due to the demands of end users to green the value chain, and in part due to increased public oversight. Rather than lowering standards, it's the regulatory and permitting process that requires review. Regulatory innovation that takes firm competitiveness and national, geopolitical, and climate objectives into consideration is desperately needed to provide more transparent timelines for permitting, clearly define the roles of different agencies to avoid regulatory duplication, and to allow for shared responsibility between regulators and the firms they regulate. Alongside that revised permitting process, the United States must seek to internationalize these higher standards. An effort on the part of the U.S. government, alongside its partners, to raise standards of ESG around the world will help to protect the environment and level the playing field to help U.S. firms compete domestically and globally. In conclusion, as America moves towards a clean energy future with massive investment in renewable energy and electrification of the vehicle fleet, we must address a deeply concerning reality. The lack of investment here in critical minerals extraction and processing leaves the country vulnerable to supply shortages and interruptions in the production of batteries, vehicles, and advanced technologies. Whereas countries such as China have invested heavily, the U.S. has for too long neglected its own natural endowments and has failed to engage with foreign allies and partners to guarantee supply. The clean energy transition cannot happen without critical minerals. To secure that supply chain, the U.S. government must work with the extractive industries at home and abroad to facilitate responsible and environmentally conscious extraction in as efficient a manner as possible. Many thanks.
Dr. Wood, thank you very much. Senator Braun has another appointment and is asked to go first. Senator Braun?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wood, just heard what you've said, and earlier I was talking to Mr. Roberts about coal. Of course, oil and gas would be there too, to where, to me, especially in that case, there's a difference between your long-term goals and what you need to do in the present. And we were energy independent. Now you're asking OPEC, to pump more. So here, though, it seems to me to be just a blatant contradiction when you're pushing electric vehicles and a lot of the things that lower greenhouse gases, and to where critical minerals are a component of all that. Talk about, do you think there is an inherent contradiction coming from the Biden administration? And do you think that in the short time that we need to get there with supply chains and find these critical minerals, in many cases, in the U.S., is the administration helping or hurting?
Thank you for the question. My take on this is that we have set an ambitious goal. Right now, we're not in a position to be able to reach that goal. Many of the critical minerals that are required for the energy transition are to be found here in the United States, but we haven't developed those resources for a number of reasons. A lot of the critical minerals are not found here in the United States, and that means that we do have to engage with allies and partners overseas to make that happen. And that's why I keep coming back to the point. This is not something that government can do alone. This is not something that industry can do alone. There does have to be a much more collaborative approach to identify where the resources are, to identify the impediments to their extraction, and to try to make sure that these are aligned with United States geopolitical and competitiveness goals. At the current point in time, I see a future where we've built factories that will produce an electric vehicle fleet, but we simply don't have the critical minerals that we need for the battery technology to make those electric vehicles functional. Today, we live in a world where we look out and we see a massive inflation of car prices because of a lack of semiconductors. In the future, we might be in a similar situation when we simply don't have enough lithium coming through to U.S. automobile manufacturers. The consequences of that are going to be massive unemployment, massive inflation, and really a failure to meet our ambitious goals.
Thank you. And I would suggest to President Biden that if you're going to put the rhetoric out there that you want to convert to electric vehicles, for those critical minerals that lay within our own country, you can't have your cake and eat it too, and you at least need to make sure we open that up if we're going to go there with policy, and then try to get the relationships built with other countries where we don't have them here. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Braun. Let me go virtual here to Dr. Prinz. Dr. Prinz, tell me what I am missing when I think that the American people should be very worried when three huge Wall Street investment firms control assets of $22 trillion, nearly the entire annual GDP of the United States. Are you concerned that this extraordinary concentration of ownership might be a danger to our economy and, in fact, with so much power in so few hands, a danger to democratic society? Dr. Prinz?
And here's why. Anytime, and what we're seeing is a precipice of a highly concentrated amount of capital. So this isn't even leveraging capital that's coming through, say, the Federal Reserve or other elements externally. This is people's capital. It's institutional capital, and it can be used and has been used to affect corporate decisions. And as Mr. Kwok mentioned, it's also been used to effectively consolidate the decisions of entire industries, whether explicitly or implicitly. The problem with that is when you have so much concentration of power and capital in the hands of such a small amount of asset management companies, there is too much potential for systemic risk because of that concentration to befall on the entire market system as well as therefore on the economy. And it's always the people in the economy that are most hurt when market disruptions or crises happen because it impacts them the most. And secondarily, if people believe that they are invested, for example, through their retirement funds, in exchange traded funds that then these large concentrated few players have amassed, and believe that therefore they are investing in companies that they perchance have some influence over, even to see the ability to proxy vote, to be real shareholders in these companies, they are mistaken in that. So what these three companies have done is they've taken away power from anyone who's invested in the markets at a smaller level, and they've concentrated power to influence mostly all of the companies in the country.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me ask Mr. Kwok a question, and that is, given that Wall Street money managers and private equity firms are nearly entirely unregulated, what ideas do you have for congressional action?
Thank you for the question, Senator. So I think there are two separate types of issues presented here. On the one hand, so private equity firms, I think there are two types of issues that have been raised regarding private equity firms. One is essentially what Senator Warren talked about, which is what private equity firms do to their portfolio companies, such as causing the company to take on a lot of debt, taking the cash out as a special dividend to themselves, and so on. I think that the act introduced by Senator Warren would be a very good first step. The second issue with private equity firms is that a lot of people think that private equity firms are not entirely above board with the investors in the private equity funds. That's a topic which the SEC recently promulgated a proposed rule to address. The issue here is, for example, private equity firms may charge fees to the fund, meaning that they have to be paid by all the investors, when they should be absorbing those fees because the private equity firm is paid a management fee by the private equity fund. I know that's a little complicated, but essentially it's possible that private equity firms are playing a little bit fast and loose with their investors' money. Turning to the large asset management firms, I think the issue that Dr. Prinz and I have been discussing is the concentration of voting power and economic power in the hands of these companies. Various scholars have proposed a number of different solutions. I'll mention a few. I'll try to be brief. Some legal scholars think that because of the competition effects, anti-competitive effects that have been noticed, this kind of accumulation of shares in all of the leading companies in one industry could be prosecuted under the Clayton Act. So that is one possibility. Some people have suggested that index funds should be limited to the amount of that they can own of any individual company, or that limit would have to be applied at the fund family level. So, for example, there would be a limit on how much a BlackRock's index funds could own of any company. The last suggestion I will mention is one that Dr. Prince has also mentioned, which is essentially allowing the shareholders in the funds to vote the shares instead of having the fund manager vote the shares. The issue there is that we'd have to have a mechanism for those shareholders to express their preferences about how they want their shares to be voted. I think that could be done. I'll spare you the details. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for holding this hearing to put the spotlight on how corporate greed is in critical sectors, especially leading to higher prices for consumers and harming workers and families. There's a number of issues I'd like to raise and ask questions about, but let me set the stage by also acknowledging that as the American economy has come roaring back, with the greatest year of job growth in our nation's history in 2021, corporate greed still casts a large shadow over our recovery. Now, Mr. Chairman, as you know, Angela and I are raising three growing boys, and so I can assure you I've seen firsthand how price increases are affecting families across the country, whether that's at the gas pump, at the grocery store, when it comes to paying for child care, at the pharmacy, and elsewhere. Now, these price increases aren't just because of rising costs or small businesses just trying to get by. Many corporations are posting record profits. Estimates show that the earnings of S&P 500 companies rose nearly 50% over the past year, while they cited increased costs to justify increased prices for American families. It should be unthinkable that during a global health pandemic, while so many working families were struggling to get by, that billionaires got richer. But they did. So as we continue our recovery, we need to both upgrade our nation's infrastructure and pass the president's plan to reduce the cost of essentials like prescription drugs, health care, child care, housing, and more. We must also ensure that wealthy corporations aren't just using the pandemic and the supply chain as excuses to exploit consumers and increase their profits. So I'm proud to be part of this committee's efforts to fight for solutions that help us build a more equitable, inclusive economy and hold corporate interests accountable. Now, the first issue I want to ask about deals with the agricultural industry and the dynamics of consolidation. Now, not only have mergers and acquisitions changed the landscape of the agricultural industry, but financial investment, including from equity-related funds in the sector, has grown significantly in recent years. At the end of 2016, the top 5 asset management firms owned at least 10%, upwards of 30% of the shares of the top firms in the agricultural and food sector. Now, given this common ownership across the industry, these firms have little incentive to bolster competition and innovation between individual firms. Instead, they can encourage inexplicable price increases to make even more profits across the entire sector. And the end result is higher prices at the grocery store for American families. So, Mr. Kwok, why is addressing the common ownership of companies important to keeping down the cost of food for American families?
Thank you for the question, Senator. You're absolutely right that the food sector is highly concentrated. So, for example, in poultry, hog, and beef processing, I believe the top 4 companies in each of those industries has more than 50% and up to 85% of the market share. The same is true in agricultural inputs, such as seeds, herbicides, and pesticides. And to give you one example, in the agricultural input markets, the largest companies are Bayer, which bought Monsanto, BASF, and Corteva and Syngenta. Syngenta is owned by a Chinese company. BlackRock is the largest shareholder of Bayer and BASF. And Corteva's three largest shareholders are Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street. So I think I'm not aware of economic research that's been done specifically on this question in this industry. But I think it's very plausible that what is happening is what has been found to be true in banking and airlines, which is that the CEOs of these companies know who their largest shareholders are, and they know that their largest shareholders will benefit from anti-competitive behavior, and therefore they engage in that anti-competitive behavior. So I think that I can't prove it, but I think that the large ownership stakes of these asset management firms could very well be leading to higher prices in the food sector.
Thank you, Mr. Kwok. Clearly more research to be done in this area. Now, Mr. Chair, let me shift for a minute from talking about putting food on the table to those who give us food for thought. Preserving local journalism is important to keeping Americans informed about what is going on in their communities, encouraging civic engagement, and countering today's rampant disinformation campaigns, as well as the dangerous spread of misinformation. Unfortunately, in regions across the country, private equity firms have bought newspapers with no intention of ensuring long-term stability. Instead, we see instance after instance of these firms gutting newsrooms to maximize short-term profits. And I'll give you one of many, many examples. A hedge fund bought the Vallejo, California's Times-Herald newspaper. As soon as that happened, the number of newsroom staff was slashed. The remaining staff's ability to cover and investigate local stories obviously dwindled, and its final reporter was fired after criticizing the extreme cost-cutting measures. Now, these types of acquisitions have contributed to the decline in newspaper newsroom employment by 57% since 2008, leaving more than 3 million Americans without access to a local paper. So the question is for Dr. Prince. Dr. Prince, how can we ensure that corporations are held accountable for gutting essential American institutions like our newspapers?
Thank you, Senator. That's an excellent question. All of the points that you've made in your statement related to this question are very important to answering it. First of all, we need to make sure, and this is largely a private equity driven execution of journalism in terms of the takeover patterns. And as you mentioned, the short-term gain interest versus the longer-term information outflow or democratic journalism interest. That's not the point of what private equity institutions do. They want short-term turnaround. And so in the field of journalism, or really even agriculture, the idea is we need to restrict the ability of these sort of hits on a concentration above, say, a certain percentage in those industries, whether it's related to journalism, whether it's related to agriculture, however it winds down on the different industry levels, because otherwise we basically open the field to the sense of capital only striving to really destroy rather than to build up certain institutions like journalism, as well as certain businesses and sectors like agriculture that work towards all of the American people in terms of if we don't concentrate them and get rid of the competition within them, then we can have a better price competitive nature and that will reduce prices. So I think it's all connected to reducing the influence of that private equity sector.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Well, Senator Padilla, thank you for your excellent questions. And let me thank each of our witnesses for appearing before the committee today. Their full statements will be included in the record. As information for all senators, questions for the record are due by 12 noon tomorrow, with signed hard copies delivered to the committee clerk in Dirksen 624. Email copies will also be accepted. Under our rules, each of our witnesses will have 7 days from receipt of our questions to respond with answers. With no further business before the committee, this hearing is adjourned, and I thank everybody for attending. Thank you.